The rain against the window pane is a familiar rhythm, a soft, persistent drum that has scored the soundtrack of my life here in Portland for more years than I care to count. It's a gentle sound, a cleansing sound, the kind of noise that washes the world clean. But it can't wash away everything. Some stains are set too deep, woven into the very fabric of memory. Inside, my small living room is an island of warmth against the damp Oregon evening. The air smells of old books, Earl Grey tea, and the wool of the half-finished quilt draped over the arm of my worn reading chair. Every object in this room has a story, a history earned through use and love. The mismatched coffee mugs in the kitchen, the chipped ceramic bird on the mantelpiece, the faint, overlapping water rings on the wooden side table. It is a life built, not inherited. My gaze, however, is fixed on a world away from all of this. It exists inside the glowing rectangle of a laptop screen, a world of polished surfaces and curated grief. On the screen, the Vance Family Foundation is celebrating its 40th anniversary. There is no rain there. There is only the soft, flattering glow of professional lighting, the muted clink of champagne flutes, and the hum of polite, wealthy applause. The backdrop behind the podium is a deep, corporate blue, emblazoned with a tasteful gold logo, a stylized tree with deep roots, its branches reaching protectively upwards. The irony is so thick, it feels like I could choke on it. Then she appears at the podium. Eleanor Vance. Even now, approaching her 90th year, she is a monument to unyielding elegance. Her silver hair is swept into a perfect chignon, not a single strand out of place. She wears a cream-colored silk blouse, the kind that whispers of expense rather than shouting it, and a single, luminous strand of pearls rests against the impossibly smooth skin of her throat. Time has etched fine lines around her eyes and mouth, but it has not touched her posture. She stands as straight and unbending as she did the very first time I saw her, a lifetime ago. The microphone picks up the whisper-soft rustle of her clothes as she adjusts her notes. Her voice, when she speaks, is exactly as I remember. Smooth, cultured, a carefully modulated instrument of persuasion. It has convinced generals, senators, and philanthropists to part with their fortunes. It has convinced an entire town of a lie. "Thank you all for joining us on this momentous occasion," she begins, a serene smile gracing her lips. It's a smile I know better than my own. I have studied it for more than 4 decades. I know the precise way it tightens at the corners when she is displeased, the way it never, ever reaches the cold, calculating depths of her eyes. 40 years of service, of hope, of reaching out to those our society so often forgets. The at-risk youth of this nation are not a statistic. They are a promise. And this foundation, born from the deepest personal tragedy, has always been our promise to them. I feel nothing. That is the curious part. The anger that once burned like a furnace in my youth has cooled over the decades into something harder, denser. It is not the absence of feeling, but the compression of it, like coal turning to diamond under immense, unending pressure. My hands rest in my lap, the skin over the knuckles thin and papery, but they do not tremble. My breathing is even. I am simply an observer, a witness. Eleanor pauses, her gaze sweeping across the opulent ballroom. It's a master's timing, letting the weight of her words settle. As many of you know, she continues, her voice dropping into a register of practiced sorrow, this journey began with a loss that I, as a mother, will carry every day for the rest of my life. It began with my son. My beloved, lost son, Leo. Lost. The word floats from the laptop speakers and hangs in the quiet air of my living room. It is such a clean word, a gentle, passive word. You lose your keys, you lose your way. It suggests an accident, a misplacement, a thing that might one day be found. It is a word that tidies up the mess, sanitizes the violence, and papers over the truth with a veneer of respectable grief. It is the cornerstone of the entire glittering lie. Leo wasn't lost. He was erased. My eyes traced the lines of Eleanor's face on the screen. I watched the subtle, almost imperceptible tilt of her head, the way she brings a delicate hand to her pearls as she speaks his name. It is a gesture of remembered pain, a piece of choreography she has perfected over thousands of performances. To the audience, she is a titan of charity, a grieving mother who turned her heartbreak into a force for good, a saint carved from marble. But I know the truth of the stone. I know how cold it is to the touch. The front door clicks open and then softly shut, pulling me from my trance. The scent of damp air and fresh groceries follows Lily into the room. My daughter. My beautiful, brilliant daughter, now a woman in her 40s with kind eyes and a skepticism she learned from a world that never gave her easy answers. She carries the shadow of a father she never knew, a ghost whose name was a forbidden word in our home for her entire childhood. She stops in the doorway of the living room, her shopping bags rustling. Her gaze flickers from my face to the glowing screen, and a familiar look of concern softens her features. It's a look I have seen countless times on this day, every year, the anniversary. "Mom," she says, her voice gentle but laced with the exasperation of a long-running argument. "Why do you still do this to yourself? Why watch it?" She doesn't understand. How could she? I have protected her from the truth, not to shield her from pain, but to allow her to grow up without the poison of hatred. Her life is her own, built on her own terms, free from the gravitational pull of the Vance name. That was the only victory I could claim for years. With a quiet click, I close the laptop. The image of Eleanor vanishes, and the room is plunged back into the soft, dim light of the evening. The only sounds are the rain and the hum of the refrigerator. I turn my head, my eyes meeting my daughter's. The steel in my gaze is not for her. It is for the world outside this room. I offer her a small, faint smile. It is the most I can manage. "Because, my dear," I say, and my voice is as soft as the rain, but the words are as hard as stone. "You have to watch the spider to know the web." Lily's question hangs in the air between us, a testament to a lifetime of unanswered questions. She sees the ritual, the quiet pain, but she cannot see the map of the web itself. To her, it is a scar on her mother's past. To me, it is a living thing, a structure whose architect I must never forget. The web wasn't spun with malice, not at first, or perhaps it was, and I was simply too dazzled to see. It was spun with threads of sunlight, with the scent of autumn in Vermont, and with the promises whispered by a boy who looked like a prince from a storybook. The most effective traps are always the most beautiful ones. 45 years ago, I was a different woman. I was 22, new to Maple Creek, and filled with a quiet, earnest hopefulness that seems impossibly naive to me now. I had moved there for a librarian job, for the charm of a small New England town that looked like it had been lifted from a postcard. I found solace in the quiet stacks, in the smell of old paper and binding glue. My life was small, ordered, and my own. And then came the day of the annual Fall Festival. Maple Creek's town green was a kaleidoscope of autumn color. The sugar maples blazed in shades of crimson and gold against a sky of impossible blue. The air was crisp and sweet with the smell of cider donuts and caramel apples. A local brass band played slightly off-key marches near the gazebo, and the laughter of children mingled with the rustle of fallen leaves underfoot. It was perfect, dangerously so. I was standing near a stall selling maple candy, trying to decide on a gift to send back home, when I felt a presence beside me. It wasn't just someone standing nearby. It was a shift in the very atmosphere, a sudden, focused attention. "The maple leaf ones are a classic," a voice said, low and smooth. "But the little log cabins are the real prize. They have more character." I turned, and the world tilted slightly on its axis. He was golden. That was the only word for him. His hair was the color of dark honey, catching the afternoon sun. His smile was easy and confident, and his eyes, a startling shade of green, held a spark of playful energy. He was dressed in a simple Aran sweater and worn jeans, but he wore them with an effortless grace that made him stand out from everyone else on the green. This was Leo Vance. He held out a hand. "You're new here." "I'd have remembered you." His confidence should have been off-putting, but it was so wrapped in charm that it felt like a compliment. I took his hand, my own feeling small and clumsy in his grasp. "Emma," I said. "I started at the library a few months ago." "The library," he repeated, his smile widening. A keeper of stories. I should have known. His thumb brushed against my knuckles, a fleeting electric touch. Leo Vance. He didn't need to introduce himself. Even after only a few months, I knew the Vance name. It was on the wing of the local hospital, on the bronze plaque at the entrance to the town park, on the lips of everyone who spoke of the town's benefactors. The Vances were Maple Creek. That afternoon, he didn't leave my side. He bought me the maple candy, the log cabins, and a cup of hot spiced cider. He guided me through the crowd with a hand resting lightly on the small of my back, a gesture that felt both protective and possessive. He told me stories about the town, pointed out familiar faces, and listened to me with an intensity that made me feel like I was the only person on that crowded green. It was intoxicating. I was a quiet, unassuming girl, and a prince had just singled me out from the crowd. I never stood a chance. The weeks that followed were a whirlwind. He filled my life, flooding it with a light so bright it cast everything else into shadow. There were long drives through the Vermont countryside in his gleaming sports car, the autumn leaves a fiery blur outside the windows. There were picnics by secluded lakes, late-night talks where he seemed to bare his soul, and lavish gifts that appeared on my doorstep for no reason at all. My small apartment began to feel crowded with his presence, with the scent of his cologne on my sweaters and the bouquets of expensive flowers he brought. My once quiet life became a duet, and then, slowly, a solo performance for an audience of one. My weekly calls with old friends became shorter, less frequent. The book club I had joined seemed trivial compared to an evening with him. He wasn't demanding my time. He was simply so captivating that I gave it to him freely, hollowing out my own world to make more space for his. Then came the day he said the words I was longing to hear. "I want you to meet my mother." The Vance estate was not a house. It was a declaration. Set on a hill overlooking the town, it was a severe, white Georgian mansion with towering columns that looked like they were holding up the sky itself. The long, winding driveway cut through acres of perfectly manicured lawn, a carpet of unnatural green that seemed too perfect to be real. Not a single leaf dared to mar its surface. Leo's hand was warm on mine as we walked up the stone steps, but I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the late autumn air. The house was utterly silent. Inside, the foyer was vast and cold, with a black and white marble floor that echoed our footsteps. The air was still and smelled of lemon oil and old money. It felt less like a home and more like a mausoleum, a pristine final resting place for a family's legacy. Eleanor Vance emerged from a room I later learned was the formal sitting room. She was as imposing as her home, dressed in tailored gray slacks and a cashmere sweater, her posture regal. She greeted me with a cool, polite smile that did not reach her eyes. They were the same startling green as her son's, but where his held a playful fire, hers were like chips of sea ice. "So, you are Emma," she said, her voice smooth as polished stone. "Leo has told me so much about you." She appraised me, her gaze moving from my face to my simple dress, to my sensible shoes. It was not a hostile look, but it was one of thorough, unnerving evaluation. I felt like a piece of china being inspected for cracks. Dinner was a quiet, formal affair in a dining room that could have seated 30. We were the only 3. Leo was relaxed and charming, guiding the conversation, but I felt Eleanor's attention on me with every bite I took, every word I spoke. She asked about my family, my upbringing, my ambitions. The questions were benign, but they felt like a cross-examination, each answer logged and filed away. After the meal, as we were served coffee in the suffocatingly perfect sitting room, Eleanor rose and walked to a glass-fronted cabinet. It was filled with collectibles, precious and delicate things. She returned with a box wrapped in silver paper. "A welcome gift," she said, placing it in my hands. My fingers fumbled with the ribbon. Inside, nestled on a bed of white satin, was a porcelain doll. It was exquisite, dressed in a gown of pale blue silk, with tiny pearl buttons and delicate lace at its wrists. Its hair was a cascade of perfect blonde curls, and its face was a mask of serene, empty beauty, its glass eyes staring at nothing. "It's beautiful," I managed to say, a little overwhelmed. "Thank you, Eleanor." She gave that same cool smile. She looked from the doll's perfect face to mine. "In our family," she said, her voice soft but clear as a bell, "we take care of beautiful things." as long as they remain pristine. I looked at Leo. He was beaming, his eyes shining with pride, as if his mother had just bestowed upon me the highest possible honor. He saw the gift as an acceptance, a sign that I had been deemed worthy of their world. I saw it that way too, or at least I tried to, but as I held the cold, lifeless doll in my hands, I felt a tremor of unease. It was a warning. I was being placed on a shelf, another beautiful object to be admired and controlled, valued only for my perfection. And I knew, with a certainty that settled deep in my bones, that I was not allowed to have any cracks. I held the cold, lifeless doll in my hands, a silent promise of the perfection required of me. But porcelain, no matter how fine, is brittle. It is made to be admired behind glass, not to be held, not to be lived in. And the first crack, the first tiny, almost invisible fissure in the flawless glaze of my new life, wasn't long in coming. It didn't begin with a shout. It began with a whisper. It began in the place that was my sanctuary, the library. Leo started visiting me at work, a gesture that seemed impossibly romantic at first. He would lean against the circulation desk, a half smile on his face, a golden prince gracing my humble kingdom of books. The other librarians would watch with gentle, envious smiles. But then the whispers would start. "It's sweet that you have this," he said one afternoon, gesturing vaguely at the towering shelves, the quiet patrons. "This little world you've made for yourself. It's very quaint." Quaint. The word stung. My career, the first real accomplishment of my adult life, was reduced to a charming hobby. When I tried to share a passage from a book I loved, he would listen with a patient sort of indulgence, his eyes glossing over. "That's nice, Em," he'd say, before changing the subject to a business deal his father was closing, a political event he'd attended. My world was small and made of paper. His was vast and real, and made of power. The whispers began to extend beyond the library walls. He met my few friends from town, the women I'd bonded with over coffee, and shared paperback novels. He was utterly charming to them, of course. But later, in the car on the way home, the analysis would begin. "Sarah is a lovely girl," he'd say, his tone thoughtful. "A bit simple, isn't she? I wonder if you don't get bored. You have such a quick mind." He wasn't telling me not to see my friends. He was simply suggesting that I had outgrown them, that my association with them was somehow beneath me now that I was with him. So I saw them less. The coffee dates dwindled. It was easier than having to defend them, or worse, having to see them through his critical, dismissive eyes. Then the criticism turned inward, polishing me, shaping me, chipping away at the person I had been. My clothes were sweet, but not sophisticated enough. My opinions were interesting, but naive. Each comment was delivered with a gentle smile, couched in the language of love and improvement. He was helping me become the woman I was always meant to be, the woman worthy of being on his arm, and I, so desperate to be that woman, began to sand down my own edges, to quiet my own thoughts, to dress and speak and think in a way that would earn his approval. The first time the whispers turned into a roar, the trigger was impossibly small. It was a Tuesday. I had made plans to take the bus to Burlington the upcoming Saturday to visit a college friend who was passing through. I mentioned it to him casually over dinner, excited at the prospect. The change was instantaneous and terrifying. The warmth in his eyes vanished, replaced by something flat and cold. He placed his fork down on his plate with a sharp, deliberate click. "You made plans?" he said, his voice dangerously quiet. "Yes, just for the day. I'll be back before dinner on Saturday." "I told you about Jenny, my friend from—" "Without asking me?" he interrupted. The quiet was gone. His voice was rising, taking on a hard, ugly edge I had never heard before. "You just decided you were going to leave for the day, without even thinking to discuss it with me?" "Leo, I didn't think I needed permission," I said, my own voice trembling. "It's just a day trip." "Permission?" He laughed, a short, barking sound devoid of any humor. He stood up, and the chair scraped violently against the floor. "This isn't about permission, Emma. This is about respect. It's about being a partner." I had plans for us this weekend, important plans. But you wouldn't know that, would you? Because you were too busy arranging your little secret life behind my back. He started pacing the small confines of my apartment kitchen, his grace gone, replaced by a caged, furious energy. This is what your simple little friends do, isn't it? They just run off and do whatever they please with no regard for anyone else. He slammed his fist down on the counter. The salt shaker jumped and fell to the floor, shattering. The sudden violence of the sound made me flinch so hard, my teeth clicked together. I stared at him, my heart hammering against my ribs. This was not the charming prince. This was a stranger, a creature of pure, incandescent rage. And then, just as quickly as it had begun, it was over. He froze, his back to me, his shoulders heaving. He turned around slowly, and his face was a mask of anguish. His eyes were filled with tears. He crossed the space between us in 2 strides and fell to his knees, wrapping his arms around my waist, burying his face in my lap. "Oh God, Emma, I'm sorry," he sobbed, his body shaking. "I'm so sorry. Please forgive me. It's just the thought of you leaving, even for a day. It makes me crazy. I love you so much it hurts. It's a sickness. Sometimes it comes out wrong. It comes out as anger, but it's just love. It's too much love. Please say you forgive me." I was frozen, trapped between the terror of the man who had screamed at me and the pity I felt for the broken boy sobbing at my feet. The whiplash was disorienting. His apology, his explanation, it didn't make sense, but I wanted it to. I wanted it to so badly. Because if his anger was just a symptom of his love, then it was something that could be managed. The alternative, that he was cruel and I was in danger, was unthinkable, so I forgave him. I stroked his hair and whispered that it was okay. I canceled my trip to see Jenny. A few days later, still shaken, still walking on the invisible eggshells that had materialized all over my apartment, I did what any confused young woman would do. I sought the counsel of an older, wiser woman. I went to Eleanor. I found her in her garden, snipping the last of the season's roses with a pair of silver shears. She listened patiently as I recounted the story, my voice faltering as I tried to explain the incident without making Leo sound like a monster or myself sound like a fool. I edited the story, softening the edges of his rage, emphasizing the depth of his remorse. When I finished, she was silent for a long moment, her focus on a rose with a single browning petal, which she snipped off with ruthless precision. "He has a temper, my dear," she said finally, not looking at me. She turned her cool green eyes on me. "It is the burden of brilliance. Men like my son, men who are destined to build and lead, feel things more intensely than ordinary people. Their passions are greater, their frustrations, therefore, are more pronounced." She set her shears in her gardening basket and gestured for me to walk with her along the stone path. When Leo was a boy, he once broke his favorite model ship, a piece he had worked on for months because he couldn't get the rigging quite right. He threw it against the wall in a fit of pique. I found him 10 minutes later weeping, trying to glue the tiny pieces back together. His anger was not about the ship. It was about his own standards, his inability to accept anything less than perfection. She stopped and looked at me, her expression one of profound maternal wisdom. "His reaction to your trip was not about you, Emma. It was about a disruption to the perfect world he is trying to build with you. It is a testament, in its own way, to how much you mean to him." A wave of relief washed over me. She understood. She wasn't horrified. She was explaining him to me. "But what do I do?" I asked, my voice small. This was the moment. This was the moment she laid the first brick of my prison wall and convinced me it was a cornerstone for our future. "A strong woman," she said, her voice dropping into a confidential, advisory tone. "A woman of substance knows how to soothe a man like that, not provoke him. You must learn his rhythms, my dear. You are an intelligent girl. You can learn what subjects cause him stress, what pressures he is under at work. You can create a peaceful haven for him, a place where he feels safe and in control. Your support, your calm, will be the anchor that keeps his passion from spilling over into anger. It is a great responsibility, but it is also a great gift. You have the power to be his peace." I left the Vance estate that day feeling not trapped but empowered. I had not been given a warning. I had been given a purpose. I was not a victim of his temper. I was the cure for it. Eleanor had handed me a manual for her brilliant, complicated son, and I, in my blind and desperate love, took it as a sacred text. I believed I was learning to manage a prince. I had no idea I was being trained to accommodate a tyrant. And so, I began my true education. I had no idea I was being trained to accommodate a tyrant. My curriculum was unwritten, my lessons delivered in the sharp tone of a voice, the sudden, unnerving stillness that fell over a room, the chilling withdrawal of affection that could last for days. I became a scholar of his moods, a cartographer of his trigger points. I learned that asking about his day at Vance Industries was safe, but asking about specific colleagues was not. I learned that spontaneity was a provocation, so our weekends were planned with military precision. I learned that my opinions were acceptable as long as they were echoes of his own. My world, which had already begun to shrink when he entered it, now contracted to the size of his approval. The library became a point of contention. "Do you really need to work so many hours?" he'd ask, his voice laced with a gentle, wounded tone. "I miss you. I want you home." So I reduced my hours. My apartment, once my own small haven, became a stage where I performed the role of the serene, supportive partner. I would ensure the lights were low, soft music was playing, and his favorite drink was ready when he arrived. I measured my success not in my own happiness, but in the absence of his rage. A day without an outburst was a victory. A week was a miracle. The calm periods were the most insidious part of the training. In those times, he was the prince I had first met. He would be tender, passionate, and attentive, showering me with affection and gifts, whispering how I was his anchor, his everything. These moments of sunshine after the storm were what gave me hope. They were the proof I clung to, that the charming man was the real Leo, and the monster was just a fleeting aberration, a demon I could learn to exorcise with enough love and care. I mistook the lulls in the abuse for the presence of love. The cycle continued, a dizzying waltz of tension, explosion, and reconciliation. His anger would flare over a misplaced set of keys, a meal that wasn't to his liking, a phone call from my mother that lasted too long. The outbursts were followed by the same desperate, tearful apologies, the same promises to be better, the same explanation that his love was just too vast, too powerful for him to control. And I, armed with Eleanor's misguided wisdom, would blame myself. I should have known he was stressed. I shouldn't have brought that up. I need to be better. I need to be calmer. I need to be his peace. It was during one of the longer periods of calm, a fragile truce that had lasted nearly a month, that my body began to betray me in a new way. It began with a profound exhaustion, a weariness that settled deep in my bones and couldn't be shaken by a full night's sleep. Then came the waves of nausea that would rise unexpectedly in the mornings, leaving me pale and shaken. I attributed it all to stress, to the constant humming anxiety of my life with Leo. It was simply the cost of my vigilance. But one evening, after a dizzy spell left me gripping the edge of the kitchen sink, my heart pounding, another thought, a terrifying and impossible one, began to surface. I stood in the small tiled bathroom of my apartment, the one place that still felt entirely my own, and stared at the small calendar tacked to the wall. With a trembling finger, I counted the days, then counted them again. The math was undeniable. The sick, dizzying truth bloomed in the pit of my stomach, cold and hot all at once. My first emotion was pure, unadulterated terror. A child, a baby. To bring a life into this, into the violent unpredictability of our home, seemed like an unforgivable sin. A wave of nausea, this one born of fear, rose in my throat. I saw a future of slammed doors and shouted words, with a tiny, innocent witness caught in the crossfire. I saw Leo's rage, already so volatile, now directed at the demands of a crying infant. I saw myself, already so isolated, now tethered completely, irrevocably, to him and to this life. The four walls of the bathroom seemed to press in on me, and I couldn't breathe. This wasn't a bond, it was a cage, and the lock had just clicked shut. I sat on the edge of the bathtub, my head in my hands, my world spinning. Trapped. The word echoed in the silent room. Trapped. But then, slowly, through the fog of fear, another thought began to form. It was small at first, a tiny, flickering spark in the overwhelming darkness. What if I was wrong? What if this wasn't a cage, but a key? The human mind has a brilliant, desperate capacity for hope. When faced with a reality that is too bleak to bear, it will construct an alternative. It will build a bridge of hope over a chasm of despair. And as I sat there on the cold porcelain, my mind began its work, spinning terror into a new and powerful narrative. A baby wouldn't be a complication. A baby would be a cure. The thought, once it took root, grew with astonishing speed. Of course, how had I not seen it? This was the answer. A baby would change everything. It would anchor him. Leo, for all his talk of business and power, was adrift. A child, his child, would give him a purpose greater than himself, a reason to conquer the demons that haunted him. It would make us a real family. The porcelain doll, the grand house, the Vance name, those were hollow symbols. A child was real. A child was flesh and blood, a living, breathing bond that could never be broken. It would solidify my place, not just as Leo's partner, but as the mother of his heir. Even Eleanor, with her cold appraisal and impossible standards, could not deny the mother of her grandchild. She would have to accept me. She would have to protect us. And Leo. Oh, Leo, it would soften him, how could it not? To see his own child, to hold his son or daughter in his arms, would surely unlock a reservoir of tenderness I knew was buried deep inside him. The man who could weep with remorse would surely weep with joy. The rage would simply melt away, replaced by a father's protective love. He would have to be better, for the baby. A breathless, dizzying hope washed over me, so potent it drove out the fear entirely. This wasn't a tragedy. It was a miracle. It was the solution I had been searching for, the missing piece of the puzzle. It was our salvation, delivered not by my good behavior or my careful management of his moods, but by a simple, miraculous act of biology. I stood up and looked at my reflection in the mirror. My face was pale, my eyes wide, but they were no longer filled with terror. They were shining with a wild, desperate conviction. I had a secret, a beautiful, powerful secret. I was not carrying a burden. I was carrying the future, a future where the prince was no longer a monster, where our home was no longer a battleground, and where love was no longer a synonym for fear. I placed a hand on my still flat stomach, a sense of profound, world-altering purpose settling over me. I had to tell him. I had to present him with this gift, this miracle that would save us all. I was about to place the weight of 2 fractured lives onto the shoulders of an unborn child, believing with all my heart that it would be strong enough to carry us to safety. It is a fragile thing, the hope of the desperate. It is a house built on sand, a candle lit in a hurricane. I look back now and see the woman I was, standing on the precipice, holding her tiny, secret miracle, believing it was an anchor that would carry her to safety. I want to weep for her. I want to scream at her, to tell her that some anchors are not meant to save you. They are meant to drag you to the bottom of the sea. I chose the perfect evening to tell him. I spent the afternoon preparing, a nervous, joyful energy humming through me. I cooked his favorite meal, roast chicken with rosemary, filling my small apartment with a warm, comforting scent. I bought a bottle of sparkling cider, a celebratory drink for our new beginning. I lit candles, casting the room in a soft, forgiving glow. I was setting the stage for a miracle, choreographing the moment that would redefine our lives. He arrived late, his mood already clipped and dark from a difficult day at his father's firm. I saw it in the hard set of his jaw, the way he tossed his keys onto the counter with a clatter that sounded like a warning. My carefully constructed atmosphere of peace was no match for the storm clouds he had brought in with him. The old, familiar anxiety began to prickle at my skin, but I pushed it down. Tonight would be different. Tonight, my news would chase the storm away. "You went to a lot of trouble," he said, looking around the candlelit room. It was not a compliment. It was an accusation. "What do you want?" "I wanted tonight to be special," I said, my voice brighter than I felt. We ate in a tense silence. I tried to draw him out, asking about his day, but his answers were monosyllabic, designed to shut down conversation. My perfect roast chicken tasted like ash in my mouth. Finally, I couldn't wait any longer. The silence was more menacing than any argument. Leo, I began, my hands trembling in my lap. I have something to tell you. Something wonderful. He looked up from his plate, his green eyes narrowed and suspicious. I took a deep breath. We're going to have a baby. The words hung in the air between us. I watched his face, waiting for the flicker of surprise, for the dawning joy, for the tears to well in his eyes. I waited for the prince to reappear, but he didn't. The man, the monster, did not even flinch. A profound stillness came over him. The anger drained away, replaced by something far more terrifying, a flat, dead coldness. It was the chilling calm at the center of a tornado. He placed his knife and fork neatly on his plate, the metallic sound unnaturally loud in the silent room. He looked at me as if I were a stranger, a distasteful insect he had just found crawling on his dinner plate. "No," he said, his voice quiet, devoid of all emotion. "You are having a baby." "What? Leo, it's ours." He let out a short, sharp laugh, a sound of pure contempt. "You did this, didn't you?" he whispered, leaning forward. The candlelight cast sinister shadows across his handsome face. "You planned this. You thought this would trap me. You thought a baby would get you the ring, the house, the name." Every hope I had articulated in the safety of my own mind, he now twisted into a cynical, ugly plot. Every beautiful dream he turned into a weapon and hurled it at me. "No," I sobbed, shaking my head. "No, I thought it would make you happy. I thought it would make us a family." "A family?" His voice rose, the cold fury now igniting into open flame. "You think you can tie me to you with this cheap, pathetic trick?" "You think I'm my father? That I'll just fall in line?" He stood up, kicking his chair back. It crashed against the wall. "I will not be trapped!" he roared, his face contorted with a rage that was more terrifying than anything I had seen before. This wasn't about a trip to Burlington or a burnt meal. This was about his life, his freedom, and he was looking at me as if I were the one who had just locked him in a cage. He grabbed my arm, his fingers digging into my flesh with bruising force. "You will get rid of it," he snarled, his face inches from mine. "No!" The word was torn from me, a primal scream of a mother protecting her child. His face changed. The fury was eclipsed by a look of pure animalistic violence. For the first time, I saw it in his eyes. He was going to hurt me. Truly hurt me. He shoved me hard. I stumbled backward, my hip hitting the edge of the counter with a sickening thud of impact that stole my breath. I cried out, more in shock and terror than in pain, and that sound seemed to break the spell. He looked at his raised hand, then at me, cowering against the counter, and a flicker of something, panic maybe, crossed his face. He turned and stormed out of the apartment, slamming the door so hard a picture fell from the wall and the glass shattered on the floor. I was left alone in the ruins of my celebration, the smell of rosemary mingling with the stench of raw hatred. The hope inside me had not just died, it had been murdered. I don't know how long I stayed there, shaking on the floor. But a single irrational thought took hold. Eleanor. I had to get to Eleanor. She was a mother. She would not allow this. She would fix this. Driven by shock and a last dying ember of foolish hope, I grabbed my keys and fled. I drove the familiar route to the Vance estate, my mind a blank hum of terror. I didn't ring the bell. The front door was unlocked, as it often was, and I slipped inside, a ghost in my own tragedy. The house was silent. I thought perhaps they weren't home. I needed a place to hide, to think. I crept into the library, the dark, wood-paneled room that always felt like the heart of the house, and sank into the shadows behind a large leather wingback chair. And then I heard them. Their voices came from the hall, low and tense. "Out of my mind, Mother! What am I going to do?" It was Leo, his voice tight with panic. Then came Eleanor's reply, and the sound of it froze the blood in my veins. It was not the voice of a concerned mother. It was calm, measured, and utterly, inhumanly cold. It was the voice of a surgeon discussing a tumor. "Hysterics are pointless, Leo. This is a complication. We will deal with it." "Deal with it?" "She said she won't. She won't get rid of it. She'll tell everyone. She'll ruin me." There was a long pause. I held my breath, my ear pressed to the cool leather of the chair. I could hear the frantic ticking of the grandfather clock in the hall, counting down the seconds of my old life. "The girl," Eleanor said finally, and the clinical detachment in her voice was the most brutal blow I had yet received. I was not Emma anymore. I was the girl. The girl is becoming a problem. Her emotional state is clearly unstable. A public scene cannot happen. We will handle this our way. A cold dread, so profound it felt like death, washed over me. I was not listening to a mother comforting her son. I was listening to two conspirators planning a strategy. "What way?" Leo asked, his voice now sounding like a petulant child's. "You will do exactly as I say," Eleanor commanded, her voice like steel. "You will go back there tomorrow and you will apologize. You will be the man she wants you to be. You will be tender, and you will be sorry. We need her compliant. We need her calm. We cannot have her running around town making accusations. We will control the narrative. We will control her. Is that understood?" I sank deeper into the shadows. A hand clapped over my mouth to stifle a sob. The floor beneath me seemed to drop away. This wasn't a family I was trying to join. It was an alliance, a corporation, and I was a liability that was about to be liquidated. Eleanor was not my ally. She was his general. And the war was against me. The hope I had carried, the beautiful, desperate hope for a baby that would save us, had done the opposite. It had just sealed my fate. I stood in the darkness of the Vance library, a ghost in my own life, listening to the blueprint of my own destruction. The terror was so absolute, so pure, it was clarifying. It burned away every last shred of hope, every lingering fantasy. There was no prince. There was no misunderstanding. There was only a problem to be handled, and I was the problem. I did not weep. The time for tears was over. My body moved with a preternatural calm, an animal instinct for survival taking over. I slipped out of the library, down the cavernous hall, and out the heavy front door into the cold night air. Every shadow seemed to harbor a threat. Every rustle of leaves was a footstep. I drove home, my hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles were white, my eyes scanning the rearview mirror, expecting to see his headlights appear behind me. I made it back to my apartment. I locked the door, drew the chain, and leaned against it, my body trembling with the delayed shock. I was a fly who had overheard two spiders discussing the design of their web. My only advantage, my only hope, was that they did not know I had heard. The next day, he appeared at my door, just as Eleanor had commanded. He held a bouquet of white roses, my favorites, their pristine petals a cruel mockery of the situation. His face was a mask of contrition. His eyes were red-rimmed, as if he had been weeping all night. He performed his role perfectly. He fell to his knees on my doorstep, burying his face in his hands. He spoke of his fear, his panic, his unworthiness. He told me he was a monster, but that my love, and the love for our child, would save him. He used all the right words, the words I had once been so desperate to hear. He swore he would be a good father. He swore he loved me. He swore it would never, ever happen again. And I, in turn, performed my role. I became the compliant girl his mother wanted me to be. I helped him up. I accepted the roses. I forgave him, my voice soft and steady. I played the part of the loving, understanding partner who had weathered a storm and was ready to embrace the calm. We were two actors in a grotesque play, speaking lines of love and forgiveness, while our eyes communicated a different truth. His eyes held a watchful, calculating glint, and mine, I am sure, held the cold, flat terror of a cornered animal. For a week we lived in this surreal truce. The air in my apartment was thick with unspoken truths, and a tension so sharp it felt like I could cut my hand on it. He was a perfect model of the man I had once dreamed of. He was gentle, attentive, and solicitous. He talked about baby names, about turning my spare room into a nursery, about the future, and I smiled and I agreed, and with every passing hour, I felt the trap closing tighter around me. I knew this was just the prelude. This was the fattening of the lamb before the slaughter. I didn't know what their plan was, but I knew I had to have my own. The end came on a Thursday. He had gone out for the evening, a business dinner he said I was too tired to attend. I used the time. My hands shaking, I pulled a small suitcase from the back of my closet. I packed only the essentials. I found a pamphlet I had picked up at the library, hidden in a book. It was for a women's shelter, 2 towns over. I called the number, my voice a whisper, and asked if they had a bed. They did. My plan was simple. I would wait until he was asleep, and then I would slip out into the night and never come back. He came home earlier than I expected. I heard his key in the lock and shoved the suitcase back into the closet, my heart hammering. I had left the book with the pamphlet on my nightstand. I realized my mistake an instant before he walked into the bedroom. He saw it immediately. He didn't say a word. He walked over to the nightstand, picked up the book, and pulled out the folded pamphlet. He read the words on it. A safe haven for women and children. He turned to look at me. The mask was gone. The actor had left the stage. The coldness in his eyes was absolute. "So the performance is over, is it?" he said, his voice a low, venomous hiss. "You were never compliant. You were plotting. Leo, please," I started, backing away. "You were going to run," he said, taking a step toward me. "You were going to take my child, and you were going to run and tell your pathetic stories to anyone who would listen." He was no longer yelling. The terrifying thing was the absence of rage. This was not passion. This was extermination. This was the dispassionate removal of a problem. He lunged. It was brutally fast. My scream was cut off as his hand clamped over my mouth. The world became a blur of terror and pain. I remember the impact as he threw me against the wall, the sharp, cracking sound that I dimly realized was one of my own ribs. I remember the suffocating pressure, his weight on me, the venomous words he spat into my ear, and I remember the final, sharp blow to the side of my head. The world exploded into a nauseating kaleidoscope of white-hot light, and then it narrowed into a tiny, dark pinhole. The last thing I saw before the darkness swallowed me completely was the faded floral pattern of my own wallpaper. I swam up from unconsciousness slowly, as if from the bottom of a deep, dark ocean. The first thing I was aware of was pain, a dull, throbbing orchestra of it, playing in every part of my body. My head felt like it was split in two. My ribs screamed with every shallow breath I took. The second thing I noticed was the silence. Not just quiet, it was a dead, profound, absolute silence. It took all my strength to push myself up from the floor. The room was dark, save for the faint moonlight filtering through the window. It was a wreck. A lamp was overturned, its shade crushed. The book lay on the floor, its pages splayed open. I stumbled to my feet, my body a symphony of agony, and called his name. "Leo?" My voice was a raw, broken croak. No answer, only the ringing in my own ears. I flicked on the light, wincing at the sudden brightness. I limped through my small apartment, a trail of destruction in my wake, a broken glass on the kitchen floor, a chair on its side. I made my way to the bedroom. The closet door was ajar. I looked inside. His side was empty. The expensive suits, the cashmere sweaters, the perfectly polished shoes, all of it was gone. A cold dread, colder and deeper than any I had felt before, began to seep into me. I stumbled into the bathroom. His razor, his toothbrush, the bottle of expensive cologne he always used. Gone. It was as if he had been systematically excised from the apartment, from my life. My final, desperate hope was the window. I pulled back the curtain and looked down at the street below. The spot where his gleaming dark green sports car was always parked, the car that was the envy of the neighborhood, was empty. He hadn't just left. He had vanished. This wasn't a man storming out after a fight. This was a calculated erasure. This was the plan. "We will handle this our way." Eleanor's cold, clinical voice echoed in my mind. They hadn't just intended to silence me. They had intended to erase him from the equation entirely, leaving me alone with an unbelievable story, a broken body, and a child he would never have to acknowledge. I stood there in the middle of my wrecked life, bruised and bleeding, the life inside me a silent, terrified witness. I was alone. The monster had not just hurt me and left. The monster had simply disappeared. The monster had vanished. The silence he left behind was a physical presence, a heavy blanket that smothered all thought. For a time, I didn't move. I stood in the wreckage of my life, a statue carved from pain and shock, while the moonlight pooled on the floor around me. The world had been peeled back to reveal a sickening, mechanical truth. Every moment of love, every whispered promise, had been a lie, a carefully calibrated step in a long, cold game. My body, however, eventually began to scream its own truth. The sharp agony in my ribs, the throbbing in my head, the sticky dampness of blood matting my hair, these were real. The life inside me, a silent passenger in this violent ordeal, was real. That reality pierced through the fog of shock. I needed help, not for me, for the baby. With clumsy, trembling fingers, I dialed the police. The act felt foolish, like praying to a god I now knew to be cruel. Who would believe me? My story was a frantic, paranoid fantasy, a powerful, wealthy man abducted and erased by his own mother to avoid a scandal. It sounded like the plot of a fever dream, but what other choice did I have? Before the police could arrive, there was a quiet, firm knock on my door. It was not the knock of a neighbor, it was the knock of someone who did not expect to be denied entry. My heart seized. I didn't answer. The knob turned. I had forgotten to relock it after my panicked call, and the door swung open. It was Eleanor. She stood on my doorstep, a figure of impossible calm amidst my chaos. She was dressed in a simple but elegant nightgown and a silk robe. There was no surprise on her face as she took in the scene, the overturned furniture, my bruised and bloodied face. There was only a cool, detached assessment, like a landlord surveying property damage. This was not a surprise visit. She had been waiting. This was the next step in her plan. "Oh, you poor dear," she said, her voice a perfect symphony of feigned shock and compassion. She stepped inside, her eyes sweeping the room, her mind clearly documenting every detail for the performance to come. She came toward me, and I flinched away, scrambling backward until my back hit the wall. "Don't touch me," I rasped. Her expression flickered with something, annoyance perhaps, but it was gone in an instant, replaced by a look of deep maternal concern. "You're in shock, Emma. It's all right. I'm here now. I'll take care of everything." She was the one who was on the phone, speaking in hushed, urgent tones, when the police finally arrived. She met them at the door, 2 officers, one of whom I recognized, Detective Miller. A man with a perpetually tired face, a man who had lived in Maple Creek his entire life and understood its unwritten laws. The first law was simple: you do not cross the Vances. Eleanor guided them in, her hand on Detective Miller's arm. "Thank God you're here," she said. "I came as soon as Leo called me. He was distraught. I've been so worried about her. Her moods, they've been so erratic lately." She was laying the foundation before I could even speak a word. Detective Miller's eyes flickered toward me, huddled on the floor, and I saw his expression harden. He didn't see a victim. He saw a problem. He saw exactly what Eleanor wanted him to see. "What happened here, ma'am?" he asked, his question directed at Eleanor, not at me. "It's been escalating for weeks," Eleanor said, dabbing at her dry eyes with a silk handkerchief she produced from her robe pocket. "Emma has been under a great deal of strain. The pregnancy, it's been difficult for her. She has these fits. Tonight, Leo said she became hysterical. She began screaming, throwing things. She threatened to hurt herself, to hurt the baby." My mind reeled. She was describing the scene but twisting it, reframing my terror as her hysteria, his violence as her own self-destruction. "And where is Leo now?" Miller asked, his pen poised over his notepad. Eleanor let out a perfectly timed, heart-wrenching sigh. "He left. He called me from a payphone down the road. He said he couldn't take it anymore. He said he was afraid of her, afraid of what she might do. He packed a bag, and he just left. He said he needed to get away, to clear his head." It was a brilliant, monstrous lie. It accounted for everything: the wrecked apartment, my injuries, his empty closet, his missing car. It was a neat, plausible story that painted Leo as a frightened man, fleeing a disturbed woman, and me as that woman. "Ma'am?" Detective Miller finally turned to me. "Is that what happened?" I tried to speak, to tell him the truth. I told him about the overheard conversation, about the conspiracy, about the assault. The The words tumbled out, frantic and disjointed, colored by the pain and terror I was feeling. I knew, even as I was speaking, how I sounded. I sounded insane. Miller listened with a look of bored patience. He glanced at Eleanor, who gave him a small, sad, knowing nod, as if to say, "See. This is what I have been dealing with." He knelt down, his expression hardening. "Your injuries," he said, gesturing to my face. "Did you do this to yourself during your episode?" The question was a physical blow. The entire world tilted, the last vestige of trust in order crumbling to dust. He wasn't investigating a crime, he was closing a file. The rest was a blur of quiet humiliation. A paramedic checked me over, treating me with a brusque, dismissive air. Miller took my statement with obvious skepticism and left with a promise to look into it, a promise we all knew was empty. The official narrative had been set in stone by Eleanor Vance before they had even walked through the door. In the days that followed, the town's betrayal began. It was a quiet shunning, a death by 1,000 paper cuts. When I went to the grocery store, conversations would halt when I walked down an aisle. Women I had once shared pleasantries with would turn their backs, their whispers following me like a cold draft. My landlady, a woman who had always been kind, suddenly informed me that she needed the apartment for a visiting relative and that my lease would not be renewed. At the library, my boss told me gently that perhaps I should take an extended leave of absence to rest and get well. The story had spread through Maple Creek like a virus. I was the crazy pregnant girl, the unstable outsider who had become violent and driven away the town's golden boy, the beloved son of their greatest benefactress. My trauma was recast as madness, my victimization as a character flaw. I was utterly alone. Every door was closed to me. I had no job, no home, no money, and a reputation that was now permanently destroyed. They had not only taken my past and my present, they had poisoned my future. I was left with nothing but the clothes on my back, the throbbing ache in my body, and the secret, silent life inside me, a life they had tried and failed to erase. Maple Creek, the idyllic postcard town, had shown me its true face. It was a town that did not protect the innocent. It protected the powerful. The final betrayal of Maple Creek was not a loud, dramatic event. It was a quiet, collective turning of the back. It was the final, suffocating silence. There was nothing left for me there but whispers and ghosts. To stay would have been a slow death, a surrender. So I ran. It was not a planned escape. It was a flight. With the last few dollars I had crumpled in my pocket, money I'd saved from my library job, I bought a one-way bus ticket to a place as far away as I could imagine. Portland, Oregon. The name itself sounded like a promise, a port, a place of arrival and departure, a city nestled at the edge of the continent, famous for its rain. The idea of rain, of a place that washed itself clean every day, felt like a salvation. I left with a single, battered suitcase containing a few changes of clothes and the porcelain doll. I don't know why I took the doll. Perhaps it was a reminder of the lie. Perhaps it was the only beautiful thing I had left, a twisted proof of the life I had almost had. Or perhaps in some dark corner of my mind, I knew that one day I would want to look into its cold glass eyes and feel nothing. The bus journey across the country was a long, rumbling purgatory. I sat with my face pressed against the cool glass, watching America scroll by, a blur of fields, mountains, and anonymous towns. I was a ghost, a pregnant girl with a bruised face and no past, heading toward a future that was a complete and terrifying blank. I arrived in Portland with $17 and the clothes on my back. The first few months were the hardest. I found a room in a boarding house, a small, grim space that smelled of boiled cabbage and despair. I found work washing dishes in a greasy spoon diner, my growing belly pressed against the edge of a steel sink for 10 hours a day, my hands raw from the hot water and harsh soap. But it was honest work. The money was my own. Every dollar was a brick in the new foundation of my life. And then, in a small, sterile room in the county hospital, with no one to hold my hand but a kindly, overworked nurse, my world was reborn. Lily arrived with a furious, healthy cry, a tiny, perfect being with a tuft of dark hair and my eyes. The moment they placed her in my arms, something inside me shifted, solidified. The aimless, drifting survival of the past months was over. I was no longer just a victim running from her past. I was a mother. I had a purpose. I had a reason to fight. My life was no longer my own. It belonged to this child, and I would die before I let the shadows of my past touch her. The years that followed were a montage of struggle, exhaustion, and a quiet, fierce, all-consuming love. We moved from the boarding house to a tiny, drafty apartment above a bakery. The rent was cheap, and the scent of fresh bread that drifted up through the floorboards in the morning felt like a small, daily luxury. My life was a patchwork of menial jobs. I cleaned office buildings in the pre-dawn darkness, Lily asleep in a makeshift bed in the janitor's closet. I waitressed late-night shifts, my feet aching, my mind on the babysitter I could barely afford. I stocked shelves at a grocery store, the repetitive motion a kind of meditation. We were poor. There is no other word for it. Our furniture was salvaged from the side of the road, our clothes came from thrift stores, and dinner was often a simple affair of rice and beans. But our small apartment, for all its material lack, was rich with what mattered. It was a fortress of love and safety that I built around my daughter, brick by painstaking brick. Our life was measured in small, tender moments. It was the circle of warm lamplight as we read library books together, my voice growing hoarse as I read the same story for the 10th time. It was the laughter that filled our tiny kitchen as we baked cookies, our hands and faces dusted with flour because I couldn't afford to waste any. It was the nights I would come home, bone-tired from a double shift, and creep into her room just to watch the gentle rise and fall of her chest, her face peaceful in sleep, and know that all the struggle was worth it. Her birthdays were celebrated with a single cupcake and a handmade card, her joy so pure and absolute it brought tears to my eyes. The Vances had left me with nothing, and from that nothing, I had built everything. The trauma, of course, was always there. It was a quiet, constant companion, a shadow that lived inside me. It manifested in the deadbolt and chain I insisted on having on every door. It was there in my deep, unshakable distrust of charming men, in my flinch at a suddenly raised voice. It was there in the nightmares that sometimes left me waking in a cold sweat, the ghost of a hand on my throat. Most of all, it was there in the silence surrounding Lily's father. She was an intelligent child, and the questions came naturally. "Mom, why don't I have a dad?" she would ask, her head tilted with innocent curiosity. I never lied to her. But I did not tell her the truth. The truth was a poison I would not allow her to drink. I would simply say, "It's just you and me, sweet girl. We're a team." And I would hug her close, changing the subject, building the walls of our fortress a little higher. I contained the darkness within myself. I carried the weight of the past so that she could have a future free of it. Years passed. Lily grew into a bright, kind, and happy young woman, my love for her the one true, unwavering constant in my life. She was my masterpiece. She was my victory. In the quiet moments, I would look at her, so full of life and promise, and know that I had succeeded. I was no longer Emma, the girl who had been broken in Maple Creek. I was not Leo's discarded property or Eleanor's failed project. I was Lily's mother, and that identity, forged in the ashes of my old life, was my armor, my strength, and my everything. That identity, Lily's mother, was my armor. For decades, it was all I needed. The past was a locked room, and I had no desire to find the key. I had my daughter, my small but peaceful life in Portland, my quiet routines. The ghost of Leo Vance and the cold shadow of his mother receded until they were nothing more than the subjects of an annual private vigil I held in front of a laptop screen. They were a story that had happened to someone else, a younger, more foolish woman I barely recognized. The peace was real. I had earned it. And then on a Tuesday in late autumn, a cardboard box arrived. It was addressed to me in the unfamiliar, looping script of a stranger. The return address was a town in New Hampshire I'd never heard of. Lily, who was over for our weekly dinner, brought it in from the porch, her brow furrowed in curiosity. "Who do you know in New Hampshire, Mom?" she asked, setting the heavy box on the kitchen table. I read the letter that was taped to the top. It was from a woman named Sarah Peterson. Her mother, she wrote, had recently passed away. Her mother's name was Mildred Gable, Mrs. Gable. The name was a whisper from another lifetime. My quiet, bird-like neighbor in Maple Creek. The one who had always offered me a small, sad smile, but had never dared to speak to me after that final, terrible day. Her daughter wrote that while going through her mother's things, she'd found a small box labeled with my name. Inside were a few letters I had written to Mrs. Gable in the first lonely year after I had fled, letters I had forgotten sending. Unsure what to do, the daughter had decided to send along a few of her mother's personal effects as well, thinking I might like to have them. A final kind gesture from a woman I had barely known. "Mrs. Gable?" Lily said, her eyes wide with a rare curiosity about my past. "From back there?" "Yes," I said, my voice quiet. From back there. That evening, long after Lily had gone home, I sat in my reading chair and finally opened the box. It smelled of lavender and mothballs, the scent of a life packed away. Inside were the mundane treasures of an elderly woman. Bundles of knitting patterns, dried flowers pressed between wax paper, a handful of old postcards, and underneath it all, 3 thick, leather-bound photo albums. A cold reluctance washed over me. This was a past I had no desire to revisit, but I felt a sense of duty to Mrs. Gable, to her final, strange act of remembrance. With a sigh, I opened the first album. It was like stepping through a portal. There was the Maple Creek town green, vibrant with autumn leaves. There was the public library, its stone steps worn smooth. Page after page of a life I had fled. It was painful, but the memories were dulled by the passing of more than 4 decades. They felt like photographs of someone else's life. It was in the third album that I found it. Mrs. Gable, her daughter's letter had explained, was a keen amateur photographer. She particularly loved taking pictures of her award-winning roses. The album was filled with them. Close-ups of pink and red and yellow blooms, and then, one page held a single, slightly faded photograph. The focus of the picture was a magnificent climbing rose bush, its crimson flowers spilling over a white picket fence. In her spidery handwriting, she had labeled it at the bottom, "My Crimson Glory, looking its best." And in the corner, a date, the day after Leo had vanished. My breath caught. My eyes drifted from the roses in the foreground to what lay beyond the fence. Mrs. Gable's garden had bordered the road directly across from the Vance estate. In the background of her photo, partially obscured by the sprawling branches of a maple tree, was the entrance to their long, paved driveway. And there was a vehicle parked there. It was not Leo's low-slung, dark green sports car. My mind held a perfect, crystalline image of that car, and this was not it. This was something else. It was a van. A large, white, windowless van. It was utterly nondescript, except for a small, dark logo on its side, too distant and blurry to make out. It looked institutional. Official. I stared at the photograph, my heart beginning a slow, heavy drum against my ribs. My first thought was not a conclusion, but a question. What is that? The official story, the one Eleanor had so masterfully crafted, was that Leo, in a fit of fear and despair, had packed his own bags, gotten into his own car, and fled, his sports car. That was the story that had been told to the police, to the town, to the world. It was the story I had been forced to live with for 45 years. But that story did not include a large, white, windowless van. My hand trembled as I went to my desk and found a magnifying glass. I held it over the photograph, my world shrinking to the tiny, faded image. The van was still just a shape, its details lost to time and distance. But its presence was a jagged rock in the smooth, placid river of the accepted narrative. It was a detail that did not belong, an anomaly, a lie within the lie. I sat there for a long time, the album open on my lap, the silence of my small, peaceful house pressing in on me. This was not a sudden, earth-shattering revelation. It was a slow-burning spark of suspicion, a single, dangerous question, igniting in the tinder of my buried past. It wasn't a clue that screamed of a conspiracy. It was a quiet, unsettling fact that whispered a single word: wrong. Everything about that day had been wrong, But this was the first piece of proof I had ever held in my hands. Why was that van there on that day? The past was no longer a locked room. A key, delivered by the ghost of a quiet neighbor, had just been slipped under the door. And I knew, with a certainty that both terrified and invigorated me, that I was finally going to have to use it. The unseen witness had, after all these years, finally delivered its silent testimony. The photograph lay on my kitchen table like a bomb. For 2 days, I did nothing. I would walk past it, my eyes averted, as if ignoring it might rob it of its power. But it was a magnetic presence in my home, a silent, damning witness that had waited patiently for nearly half a century. It had fractured the piece I had so carefully constructed, and I knew, with a certainty that settled like a stone in my gut, that the cracks would only widen. The question it posed, why was that van there on that day, demanded an answer. And I knew I could not seek it alone. To do so would be to risk falling back into the madness, into the paranoid whispers of the past. This time, I would not be a lone, hysterical woman. This time, I needed an ally. When Lily came for dinner that Sunday, I waited until we had finished eating. I took a deep breath, the air feeling thin and insufficient, and I finally opened the door to the locked room of my past, just a crack. "Lily," I began, my voice steadier than I expected, "I need to show you something. And I need you to look at it with clear eyes." I laid the album on the table, open to the page with Mrs. Gable's photograph. I didn't tell her the story of the assault, not yet. The whole truth was too vast, too monstrous. I started with the anomaly, the single thread. "This picture was taken the day after Leo Vance disappeared," I said, pointing to the date. "The story I was always told, the story everyone was told, was that he packed a bag and left in his sports car." Lily leaned forward, her brow furrowed. I watched her eyes trace the same path mine had, from the crimson roses to the background to the partially hidden white van. "Okay," she said slowly. "So that's not his car?" "No," I said. "It's not." She looked up at me, her gaze filled with a deep, protective concern. "Mom, this was 45 years ago." "What are you thinking? Are you sure you want to stir this up? For what?" "It's not going to change anything. It's not going to bring you any peace." Her skepticism was a shield meant to protect me. I understood it. But she didn't see the look in my eyes. It was not the wild, frantic look of a woman chasing ghosts. It was the calm, cold certainty of a woman who has just been handed a piece of a puzzle she had long forgotten she was solving. "I don't know if it will bring me peace, Lily," I said quietly. "But for the first time in my life, I have a question that might actually have an answer. All I'm asking is that you help me find it. Please." She saw the resolve in my face. She saw that this was not a fleeting whim. Her skepticism gave way to a fierce loyalty that was so much a part of her character. She took a deep breath and nodded. "Okay, Mom, okay." "What do we do?" And just like that, we were a team. The following evenings were spent huddled over Lily's laptop, the glow of the screen illuminating our faces. She was the general in this new, digital war, her fingers flying across the keyboard with a speed and intuition that amazed me. Our initial searches were fruitless. White Van, Vermont 1970s yielded nothing but pictures of hippie vans and old delivery trucks. "We need to think about what it was doing there," Lily mused, her expression intent. "It looks medical or institutional." She began to use different search terms, a clever combination of words I would never have thought of. Vermont Discrete Patient Services, New England Private Long-Term Care Relocation, Secure Medical Transport 1970s. Hours were spent scrolling through digitized business registries, old phone directories, and archived newspaper articles. It was a tedious, soul-crushing search for a ghost company. Then, late one night, she found it. It was buried in an archived list of state business licenses that had been dissolved in the early 1980s. The name was chilling in its blandness. Northeast Logistical Medical Solutions. It was listed as a private transport company. Lily, with a few more clicks, found a cached, barely functional remnant of its old, simple website. There was no client list, no photographs. There was only a single defining sentence in its description of services. I leaned over her shoulder and read the words aloud, my voice a hoarse whisper. Specializing in the discreet, long-term relocation of patients to private care facilities. Discreet relocation. It was a euphemism for making people disappear. Lily looked at me, her eyes wide. The skepticism was gone, replaced by a dawning horror. "Mom, this is a thread," I said, my voice shaking slightly. "And we have to pull it." But we had hit a wall. We had a name, but we had no access to its records, no way to know who its clients were or where it took them. We could go no further on our own. For the first time since I had fled Maple Creek, I knew I needed help from the kind of institution I had spent my life avoiding. I needed a lawyer. Mr. Harrison's office was in a modest but respectable building downtown. He was a man in his late 50s, with sharp, intelligent eyes and a calm, empathetic demeanor that immediately put me at ease. We had been referred to him by a friend of Lily's, who had described him as methodical and tenacious. We sat across from his large oak desk, and I laid out our story. But I followed a strategy that had come to me in the dead of night. I did not begin with a story of assault, conspiracy, and a faked disappearance. I began with a simple, legally sound premise. "Mr. Harrison," I said, my hands folded calmly in my lap. "My daughter, Lily, is the biological child of Leo Vance. He disappeared when I was pregnant and has been considered a missing person for 45 years. We have reason to believe that his family, specifically his mother, Eleanor Vance, may know more about his disappearance than she has revealed. We would like to explore the possibility of a future inheritance claim for Lily, and as part of that, we need to investigate the Vance family's financial activities around the time of his disappearance." He listened patiently, his face professional and non-committal. I could see the thoughts forming behind his eyes. A long-shot case, a daughter seeking a piece of a massive fortune, a difficult and expensive fight against a powerful family. "Ms. Emma," he said kindly, "these cases are incredibly difficult. The burden of proof would be immense, and the Vance's legal resources are practically unlimited." "I understand," I said. Then I slid the photograph across the desk. "This was taken the day after he vanished." I pointed to the van. Then I handed him the printout from the defunct company's website. "And this is the company we believe owned that van." He put on a pair of reading glasses and studied the documents. He was silent for a full minute, his sharp eyes moving back and forth between the faded photo and the chilling description of services. The professional detachment in his expression began to dissolve, replaced by a flicker of intense, professional curiosity. He looked up at me, and for the first time, I felt he was truly seeing me, not as a potential client with a flimsy case, but as a woman with a story that had been buried for a very long time. "Discreet, long-term relocation," he read aloud softly. He looked at me, then at Lily. "This isn't just about inheritance, is it?" "No, Mr. Harrison," I said. "It's not." A slow smile spread across his face, not a smile of humor, but one of a craftsman who has just been presented with a fascinatingly complex and challenging piece of work. "I'll take the case," he said. "We will proceed under the pretext of an estate inquiry." It's the perfect cover. Let's see what happens when we start pulling on this thread. Leaving his office, I felt a feeling I hadn't experienced in decades. It wasn't hope, not yet. It was momentum. The single thread was no longer just in my hands. It was in the hands of an expert, and he was about to start unraveling a web that had been woven 45 years ago, a web I was finally ready to burn to the ground. We had thrown a stone into the dark, deep water of the Vance family's past, and now all we could do was wait for the ripples. The initial weeks of Mr. Harrison's investigation were an exercise in frustration. He sent formal inquiries, couched in the careful, polite language of the law, to the Vance family's legal team. The replies were equally polite and utterly unhelpful. They were masterpieces of obfuscation, acknowledging nothing, denying nothing, revealing nothing. Months began to stretch by. The Vance's lawyers were masters of the delay, filing motions and requests for clarification that seemed designed only to exhaust our resources and our resolve. Mr. Harrison's requests for financial disclosures from the Vance Family Foundation were met with impenetrable walls of legal protection. The foundation, he explained to us in a phone call that left me feeling weary and defeated, was an ironclad fortress. Its books were pristine, its charitable donations impeccably documented. It was, on paper, a perfect organization. "They're trying to bleed us dry, Mom," Lily said one evening, her frustration palpable. "They think we'll just give up." "I've waited 45 years, I told her, my voice quiet but firm. "I can wait a little longer." But I could tell Mr. Harrison was growing impatient with the stonewalling. A good lawyer is like a good detective. When one door is triple bolted, he looks for a window. And that's what he found. The call came on a gray Wednesday afternoon. "Emma, Lily, Mr." Harrison's voice on the speakerphone was different. It was stripped of his usual calm professionalism. It was electric. "I need you to come to my office, now." The drive downtown was a blur of silent tension. We didn't speak, but the same question hung in the air between us. What did he find? We were shown immediately into his office. He was standing by the window, but he turned as we entered, a thin, triumphant smile on his face. His desk was covered in neat stacks of financial statements. "The foundation was a dead end," he began, gesturing for us to sit. "So I stopped looking at it. Instead, I subpoenaed the records for Eleanor Vance's personal accounts. It took a court order and a fight, but I got them. Decades of them." He picked up a single sheet of paper, a summary he had prepared. "For the last 45 years, beginning the month after Leo Vance disappeared, a payment has been made from Eleanor's private trust. The same amount every single month, like clockwork. The payment doesn't go to a person, it goes to a holding company." He let that sink in before continuing. "A Delaware corporation named Sonoran Holdings, LLC. On paper, it has no employees and conducts no business. Its sole purpose, as far as the public record is concerned, is to own and manage a single piece of real estate." He turned his computer monitor toward us. On the screen was a satellite image. It showed a vast, arid landscape of red rock and desert scrub. And in the middle of it, like a wound, was a patch of impossibly lush green. A large, sprawling compound surrounded by high white walls. I could see a swimming pool shimmering like a sapphire, perfectly manicured gardens, and several long, low buildings with red-tiled roofs. There was only one road leading in or out, and it was blocked by a large, formidable gatehouse. "This is in a remote corner of Arizona," Mr. Harrison said, his voice low. "It's listed as a private wellness sanctuary. There is no sign, no website, no public profile. It is, for all intents and purposes, a ghost. A very, very expensive ghost that Eleanor Vance has been funding for nearly half a century." My heart was hammering. "A luxurious prison." "This is incredibly suspicious," he continued, turning back to us. "But it's not proof." I knew the Vance's lawyers would have a dozen plausible explanations for it. A private retreat for the family, a secret getaway. So I took a risk. I hired a private investigator, one of the best. I sent him to Arizona. He leaned forward, his eyes boring into mine. It took him 2 weeks. The security is immense, but he found a high point in the rocks, nearly a mile away. He sat there day after day with a long-distance telephoto lens. Yesterday he sent me this. He reached across his desk and slid a large, plain manila envelope toward me. It felt as if it weighed 1,000 pounds. My hands trembled as I fumbled with the clasp. Lily moved her chair closer, her hand resting on my shoulder for support. I pulled out a single large photograph. It was slightly grainy, the heat shimmering off the distant ground. It showed a verdant, sun-drenched garden inside the compound walls. A woman in a crisp, white nurse's uniform was pushing a wheelchair along a stone path. In the wheelchair sat a man. He was old, his hair was thinned and gray, and a plaid blanket was tucked neatly over his lap. His face was slack, his eyes staring blankly at something beyond the frame. He looked frail, lost, his body aged by time. But the face, the high cheekbones, the shape of the jaw, the hooded eyes. It was a face I had seen every day in my nightmares and in my memories for 45 years. The monster had grown old. The prince had withered, but it was him. It was, without a single shred of doubt, Leo Vance. The air left my lungs in a single, silent gasp. The photograph slipped from my fingers and fluttered onto the desk. Lily let out a small, strangled cry, her fingers digging into my shoulder. The ghost was real. He was alive. Mr. Harrison's voice seemed to come from a great distance, giving words to the impossible, earth-shattering truth we were staring at. "He never ran away, Emma," he said softly. "He never disappeared. She hid him. She locked him away from the world in a gilded cage, and for 45 years, she built a philanthropic empire on the lie of his tragic disappearance." He leaned back in his chair, his gaze filled with a grim, triumphant finality. "Your ex-boyfriend wasn't lost. His mother had him institutionalized." The photograph lay on the polished oak of Mr. Harrison's desk, a piece of irrefutable, catastrophic truth. In that moment, staring at the face of the ghost who had haunted my life, the path forward became clear with an unnerving, crystalline certainty. Lily was the first to speak, her voice trembling with a mixture of horror and rage. "We go to the police. Right now." "We show them this. Kidnapping, unlawful imprisonment. What she's done is monstrous." Mr. Harrison nodded slowly. "Legally, we have a very strong case. The authorities in Arizona would have to be notified. It would be a media firestorm." But I shook my head. The thought of police, of courtrooms, of a public spectacle left me cold. The legal system had failed me once, spectacularly. It had listened to the calm, rational lie of a wealthy woman and dismissed the frantic, messy truth of a traumatized girl. Justice, for me, would not be found in a courtroom. It would not be found by putting a sick, broken old man on trial. The monster was not Leo. The monster was, and always had been, his mother. My reckoning was not with the state. It was with her. "No," I said, my voice quiet but absolute. "Not yet. There is something I have to do first." Alone. Lily started to protest, her protective instincts flaring, but she stopped when she saw my face. The fear was gone. The hesitation was gone. After 45 years of being a reactor, a survivor, I was finally the one who was going to act. I was going to the heart of the web. The flight to Vermont was a strange inversion of my desperate bus ride all those years ago. I was not fleeing. I was returning. The young, broken girl was gone, and in her place was a woman armed with a truth so heavy it felt like a weapon in my luggage. I watched the clouds from the airplane window, feeling a sense of cold, purposeful calm I hadn't known since before I'd first set eyes on Leo Vance. The Vance estate had not changed. It stood on its hill, as pristine and imposing as ever, a monument to a lie. I drove my rental car up the long, winding driveway and parked behind a gleaming black sedan. I walked up the stone steps, my sensible shoes making no sound, and rang the bell. A uniformed housekeeper opened the door. I asked for Eleanor Vance. She showed me into the formal sitting room, the very same room where, a lifetime ago, I had been given the porcelain doll. And there she was. Eleanor sat in a high-backed armchair, a book resting in her lap. She was older, more fragile, the skin on her hands as thin as parchment, but the posture was the same, the back ramrod straight, the head held high. Her cold green eyes looked up as I entered, and she registered no surprise. It was as if she had been expecting me for 45 years. We did not speak. The air was thick with the weight of our shared, unspoken history. I walked across the plush oriental rug, my heart a slow, steady drum. I reached the marble coffee table that stood between us, and I placed the photograph on its polished surface, face up. I watched her face, waiting for the gasp, the denial, the flicker of fear. There was nothing. She did not flinch. Her gaze drifted down to the grainy image of the old man in the wheelchair, then back up to my face. Her expression was one of cool, intellectual curiosity. She was the one who broke the silence. "So," she said, her voice a dry rustle of leaves, "the detective work is finally complete. I confess, I'm impressed it took you this long." The sheer, breathtaking audacity of it stole my breath. There was no remorse, no shame, only the cold appraisal of an opponent in a game. "Why?" The word was a raw whisper. She smiled, a faint, bloodless stretching of her lips. "Why?" she repeated, as if tasting the word. "Because you are a sentimentalist, Emma, and I am a pragmatist. You see a tragedy. I see a solution to a complex problem." She leaned forward slightly, her voice taking on a confidential, almost professorial tone. "That famous Vance temper," she began. "It wasn't a temper. It was a sickness, a flaw in the code, you might say. A degenerative neurological condition that runs through the men in my family. My father had it. We called it the Vance affliction. It begins with passion and brilliance, but it curdles into paranoia, impulse control failure, and violent, unpredictable rages. I knew Leo carried it long before you ever met him." I stared at her, my mind refusing to process the monstrous logic she was laying out. "He was manageable," she continued, her voice dispassionate. "I could control his environment, smooth over his episodes. You were manageable. But then you became pregnant. And that, my dear, changed the entire equation." Her eyes were like chips of ice. "I could not, would not, allow that flaw to be passed on. I would not allow another generation of my family to be tainted by it. The Vance name, the legacy my grandfather built, was not going to be brought down by a corrupted bloodline." The final terrible pieces of the puzzle clicked into place, the final assault. The night he had nearly killed me. That night, she said, anticipating my thought, was not simply a lover's quarrel. It was a full-blown psychotic break. He would have killed you, and the child. He was no longer my son in that moment. He was merely the sickness. And the sickness had to be contained. "So you hid him," I breathed, the horror of it a physical weight in my chest. "I saved him," she corrected, her voice sharp. "And I saved our name. While you were unconscious, my private physician sedated him. The transport team, the discreet professionals you seem to have discovered, removed him. I erased the problem. I created the foundation in his memory, the perfect, tragic story to cover the ugly clinical truth. I did what was necessary." She leaned back in her chair, a look of serene, unshakable conviction on her face. Her confession was complete. "A flawed piece must be removed from the board, not allowed to ruin the entire game," she said, her voice dropping to a near whisper. "You, the child, you were acceptable losses. He was my son, and I protected our name from his sickness." I looked at the woman before me, a creature so far removed from the spectrum of human empathy that I could find no words. There was no arguing with this logic. There was no screaming at it. It was perfect, self-contained, and utterly monstrous. I had come here seeking a confrontation with a human being, but I had found something else entirely. Slowly, I stood up. I did not take the photograph. I left it there, on the table between us, a testament to her crime sitting in the heart of her perfect, sterile home. I turned my back on her, on the house, on the entire wretched history. As I walked out of that silent, cold room, I finally understood. The real prison wasn't the luxurious sanctuary in Arizona where Leo was hidden. The real prison was here, in this house, and Eleanor Vance was both its architect and its sole, eternal prisoner. I walked away from the Vance estate for the second time in my life. The first time, I was a frightened girl, fleeing with nothing. This time, I was a woman leaving a tomb, carrying everything I needed, the truth. As I drove away, the imposing white mansion shrinking in my rearview mirror, I felt a profound and unsettling calm. My confrontation with Eleanor had clarified everything. I now understood that her soul was a fortress, impenetrable to guilt, shame, or remorse. A prison sentence would be an inconvenience to her, the judgment of her peers, a nuisance. She lived in a world where such things could be managed by lawyers and public relations firms. But her legacy, the pristine, benevolent image she had spent a lifetime and a fortune cultivating, was not a fortress. It was a house of cards, and I had just been handed the gust of wind that could bring it all down. Justice would not come from locking her body in a cell. Justice would come from destroying the one thing she truly loved, her good name. Back in Portland, I met with Lily and Mr. Harrison. I recounted the conversation with Eleanor, her chilling, pragmatic confession. Lily wept, not for the monster Leo had been, but for the profound, calculated cruelty his mother had shown. Mr. Harrison sat in stunned silence, slowly shaking his head. "This is beyond anything I could have imagined," he said finally. "It's a story of almost mythological evil." "So we go to the press," Lily said, her voice hard with a newfound anger. "We burn them to the ground." "Yes," I agreed, "but not just any press. We need a cannon, not a slingshot." Mr. Harrison knew a journalist, a Pulitzer Prize-winning investigative reporter at a major national newspaper, a woman famous for her tenacity and her refusal to be intimidated by power or wealth. A meeting was arranged. We sat in a sterile conference room in a downtown skyscraper, a world away from the emotional turmoil of the last few weeks. We presented the journalist, a sharp-eyed woman named Sarah Jenkins, with the entire story. We gave her the photograph. We gave her the financial records Mr. Harrison had uncovered. We gave her the details of the transport company and the Arizona sanctuary. And then, I told her everything, from the first crack in the porcelain to Eleanor's final, chilling monologue. I spoke calmly, my voice even, letting the unadorned horror of the facts speak for themselves. Jenkins listened without interruption, her pen flying across her notepad. When I finished, she was silent for a long moment. She looked at me, her professional skepticism battling with the sheer Gothic monstrosity of the tale. "I will need to corroborate this," she said, her voice all business. "But if even half of this is true, this is one of the biggest stories of my career." 2 weeks later, the cannon fired. The story broke on a Sunday morning on the front page of the newspaper's digital edition. The headline was stark and damning. "The Lost Son, a 45-year deception. How philanthropy's grande dame imprisoned her heir to protect a family secret." It was an explosion that sent shockwaves across the country. The article was a masterpiece of investigative journalism, laying out the entire sordid history with cold, verifiable facts. It had the photograph of Leo in his luxurious prison. It had quotes from former employees of the defunct transport company. It had financial charts showing the flow of money from Eleanor's personal accounts. And it had my story, told with a quiet dignity that made it devastatingly believable. Within hours, it was the biggest news story in the world. It was picked up by wire services, debated by talking heads on cable news, and dissected endlessly on social media. The narrative was irresistible. A story of immense wealth, dark secrets, a mother's unthinkable cruelty, and a lifetime of lies. The reckoning for Eleanor Vance was not legal. It was cultural. It was absolute. The Vance Family Foundation, her life's work, imploded. Major corporate donors pulled their funding overnight. The board of directors resigned en masse, issuing statements of shock and condemnation. The Vance name was stripped from hospital wings, university libraries, and museum galleries in a cascade of public repudiation. The stylized tree with its deep roots, once a symbol of hope, was now a symbol of grotesque fraud. Eleanor, who had spent a lifetime courting public opinion, was now its primary victim. She was no longer Saint Eleanor, the grieving mother. She was a monster, a villain, the architect of a lie so profound it captured the public imagination. News helicopters hovered over the Maple Creek estate, filming the grand house that was no longer a palace, but a besieged fortress. News vans camped outside the gates, their satellite dishes pointed at the sky like weapons. I saw a brief news clip of her, a grainy, long-lens shot through a window. She was standing, looking out at the media circus she could not control. For the first time, her perfect, regal posture seemed stooped, her shoulders slumped under an invisible weight. Her reputation had been her armor, and it had been utterly disintegrated. She was left naked to the judgment of a world she could no longer fool. I didn't feel joy as I watched the fallout. I didn't feel triumph. I felt a quiet, somber sense of finality. A great and terrible wrong had been exposed to the light. I had not destroyed Eleanor Vance with rage or revenge. I had simply held up a mirror, and the entire world had been horrified by the reflection. The justice was not in her punishment. It was in the irreversible demolition of her beautiful, perfect lie. The storm eventually passed, as all storms do. The media, having feasted on the carcass of the Vance family's reputation, moved on to fresher tragedies. The news vans disappeared from the gates of the estate in Maple Creek. The world, by and large, forgot. But I did not. For me, the quiet that followed the noise was the true victory. It was a silence no longer filled with unspoken secrets and buried pain, but with a clean, open stillness. The ghost had been faced, the web had been burned, and the spiders had been left to suffocate in the ashes of their own meticulously crafted world. We heard, through Mr. Harrison, that what was left of the Vance fortune was being systematically dismantled by lawsuits and penalties. He told us that a settlement for Lily, a substantial one, would be ours for the taking. The remaining family members would surely pay anything to make the last vestige of the scandal disappear. I told him no. To take their money would be to remain bound to them, to allow their tainted legacy to fund my future. My entire life since leaving Maple Creek had been a declaration of independence. That freedom, earned through decades of hard work and sacrifice, was a currency far more valuable than anything in their vaults. We wanted nothing from them. A few months later, on a soft, gray afternoon in Portland, Lily and I sat on a park bench, watching children play near the duck pond. The air was cool and damp, carrying the clean scent of wet earth and roses from the nearby garden. It was a simple, peaceful, ordinary day. It was the kind of day I had fought my entire life to be able to have. Lily was quiet for a long time, watching me as I threw small pieces of a bread crust to the eager ducks. Finally, she spoke, her voice filled with a gentle, wondering awe. "After all that," she said, "after everything she did to you, to us, you let the world handle her. You stood in her house, you faced her, and you never even screamed." I smiled, a real, easy smile that reached my eyes. I thought about the rage that had once been a furnace inside me, now cooled to a quiet, knowing peace. I thought of Eleanor, trapped in her silent, disgraced mansion, a queen with no subjects, a matriarch with no legacy. "Screaming is for the people who have lost," I said, looking at my daughter, my beautiful, strong daughter, the one good and perfect thing to come from all that darkness. She was the one who lost everything, Lily. Her son, her name, her entire life's work. It all turned to dust. I reached out and took her hand, my weathered fingers lacing through hers. "I lost a life I thought I wanted," I told her. "But I found you. I won." We sat in comfortable silence as the afternoon light began to fade, our shared warmth a fortress against the coming chill. The story was over. The public story, at least. But my story, the one that had been silenced for so long, was just beginning. That evening, I sat at the small desk in the corner of my living room, the same desk where Lily used to do her homework. The lamp cast a warm, golden circle of light on the surface. For 45 years, Eleanor Vance had written my story. For 2 weeks, the media had written my story. Now, it was my turn. I opened my laptop, the screen humming to life. I was not doing this for revenge. Revenge was a poison, and I had spent a lifetime cleansing myself of it. I was not doing this for fame or money. I was doing this because the silence had been broken, and I would not allow it to settle again. I was doing this for the scared 22-year-old girl who had been told her truth was madness. I was doing it for all the other women in all the other towns whose stories had been stolen, buried, or disbelieved. My hands, which had once trembled with fear, were steady. They rested on the keyboard, poised and ready. The cycle of pain, the legacy of the Vance affliction, had ended with me. It would not be passed down. It would be transformed. The trauma would not be a ghost that haunted the next generation. It would be a story of survival. I took a deep breath, and I began to type.